Good morning and welcome to the virtual Fairfield Museum Wednesday morning Storytime. My name is Karen Burke and I'm the librarian in the research library here at the museum. As you know, right now the museum is closed to the public. Our staff is bringing you these fun new virtual adventures and providing content online. Please consider supporting the museum through membership or donation. We are a private, nonprofit, and depend upon the support of people like you. You can find out about how to give and about all of our virtual museum offerings online at our website at fairfieldhistory.org. Thank you. Today I'm live from the library inside the Fairfield Museum to read you a chapter from the book The House with 60 Closets by Frank S. Child. Mr. Child was a founding member of the Fairfield Historical Society who wrote many books. This book, written in 1899, is about a house in Fairfield called the Sherman Parsonage. It was built in 1804 by Judge Roger Minute Sherman and was located on the Old Post Road here in Fairfield. It was the biggest house in Fairfield at the time. When Judge Sherman and his wife Elizabeth died, the house was given to the Fairfield Congregational Church to be used as a parsonage. This is a long story, so I'm going to read you one chapter called Portraits, Walk, and Talk. This story takes place at Christmas time in the Sherman Parsonage. It is 50 years after the judge and his wife Elizabeth have died, and there is now a family with 15 children living in the house. There aren't a lot of pictures for this book, but I thought I'd show you the cover, The House with 60 Closets. Portraits, Walk, and Talk. It was Christmas Eve. Excitement had reached fever heat. The children knew nothing about Christmas in the East, and their Western festivals had always been simple, for there was little money to use in buying gifts. But this year, friends had remembered them, and they had also earned several dollars by various kinds of work, so that they were sure of many nice things. So that had they not been buying presents for each other, these 10 days, was not every closet in the house made the hiding place for a treasure? The nervous strain on the parents was great. Such confusion and anxiety past words. Was it possible ever to get the house and the family settled down to plain, everyday living again? It happened that the children had all met in the East Parlor. This was the room where the pictures of the judge and his wife adorned the wall. And you can see these portraits here at the museum. We have both the judge and Elizabeth portraits here in our collection. The two portraits hung on the right of the fireplace, just over the piano. A lamp was giving a faint light on the marble center table, and a cheerful wood fire was burning on the hearth. In front of the piano was the music stool. The children were all talking. The hum and buzz of their many voices filled the room. One said, "I wonder if Santa Claus will bring me a doll." And another said, "There's no such person as Santa Claus." And a third said, "I want a new sled." And a fourth said, "Father promised me a book about birds." And so the talk continued. But Ruth, for one, kept still. She was worn out with excitement. As she flung herself into a big armchair, she turned her head towards the fire and began to see all sorts of funny creatures dancing in and out among the coals. Ruth was a poet, gifted with a wonderful imagination, and she could see more strange things and tell more wild stories than any other child in the family. And that is saying a great deal, for they all had a way of telling about things which they had heard and seen that constantly reminded their neighbors of Western largeness and exaggeration. So there's Ruth, sitting in her armchair looking at the fire. As Ruth watched the queer creatures playing in the fire, her eyes grew heavy, and then she turned her head away for a moment, and her eyes became fixed upon the pictures of the judge and his wife. Did her head droop to one side, and did it fall softly upon the cushion against the arm, or did her eyes suddenly open wide with surprise, and did she gaze with startled look upon a strange scene before her? For both the judge and his wife seemed to be moving, and they looked so natural and pleasant when they smiled and bowed that Ruth said to herself, "Why, they must be alive." And the judge reached out his hand from the canvas which held him and took the hand of his wife, who had responded to his motion, and said, "My dear, wouldn't you like to step down and out for a little while?" "Yes, thank you," she replied. "I think it would rest me." And then he laid down the pen, which he holds in the picture, and stepped lightly upon the piano, still keeping her hand in his. And then he helped her down upon the piano, and he stepped down to the music stool and finally on the floor, and she followed. So here he is stepping out of his portrait, and there is Elizabeth, and here's the table that he's stepping on to the piano. This was all done with a grace and dignity that marked the usual movements both of the judge and his wife. And it seemed the most natural thing in the world for them to step down and out. Ruth sprang toward them on the instant that they stood upon the floor. She rubbed her eyes to make sure that she was not dreaming, and then as she saw them really before her, looking for all the world like natural folks, she greeted them with delight. "Why, how do you do?" she exclaimed. "I always thought you looked as if you would like to talk. That, I suppose, is why people say that your pictures are a speaking likeness. But I never thought you'd get out of the pictures. How did you do it?" But the judge and his wife were too much absorbed in the scene before them to reply immediately. The old room had changed since their day. They were noting the changes, and then this room full of children took them by surprise. "My dear," said the judge to his wife, "this is delightful." "Yes," continued Ruth, "they all belong to us. I heard the president of the Dorcas Society say that when the church called this minister, they expected him to fill the parsonage just as much as the pulpit, and we did it." "Yes, this is delightful," repeated the judge. "How many are there?" he said to his wife, but Ruth answered, "Oh, there are only 15 of us when we are by ourselves. There are a good many more when the neighbors' children come in, and then don't we have grand times." "It almost takes my breath away," Mrs. Judge was speaking to her husband. "My dear, have you my fan in your pocket?" And the judge felt in his pocket, but he didn't find any fan. "Why, it's Christmas. You don't want a fan," said Ruth, who was bound to take part in the conversation and play the hostess on this wonderful occasion. And then the judge and his wife stood stock still and gazed with increasing pleasure and interest upon the scene. Their descent from the picture had been so noiseless and unexpected that Ruth was the only one to observe it. But when this keen, talkative sister began to question the guests, the other children turned their heads, and they beheld the curious sight. There stood the judge and his wife exactly as they appeared in the portraits, only they had their legs on them, and the pictures didn't. But the children noticed even the smallest details of dress, and they were the very originals of the portraits. Suddenly, the whole company stood up. "Why, it's just like a reception or a wedding," said Ruth. "I think they're all waiting to be introduced." And the children advanced one after another, or Ruth led the judge and his wife to different parts of the room, and each brother and sister and cousin was properly presented. "How did you get out?" inquired Ruth a second time. Everybody in the room was now standing, and all eyes were looking for the next move in this strange parlor drama. "We just stepped out," replied the judge, who seemed prepared at length to talk with Ruth or the other children. "But where did you keep your legs all the time?" When Ethel asked this question, Mrs. Judge blushed. Elizabeth, the eldest daughter, pushed her way forward and said, "Shh," and Samuel said, with a nudge of the arm, "Keep still, can't you? But you might as well tell the steaming tea kettle to stop boiling as it sits upon a lively fire." "We are very glad to see you," interrupted Helen. She was a most hospitable girl, and she had read a great deal of history, although Henry knew more history than she did, and he had read everything about the judge that he could lay his hands on. "We are very glad to see you, and should like to ask about the Hartford Convention," said Henry. "He's been talking about it for a month," continued Ruth. "I wish you'd tell him all about it, and then maybe he'd keep still. I don't care anything about it, neither do the other children. But Henry thinks he's very smart in such things ever since he got a prize in history." "Did you say these were all the children?" It was Mrs. Judge that now spoke. And as she made the inquiry, Susie ran out of the parlor and disappeared in the gloom of the hall. "Why, we forgot all about the baby!" exclaimed Ruth. "He's upstairs asleep, I guess. Dear me, you must see the baby. He's the cutest little thing you ever saw." "Yes, we should like to see him, of course. We both like babies, good babies." "Babies that don't cry, I suppose you mean," said Ruth. "Well, he doesn't cry much, Only when he's hungry, or a pin sticks into him, or he gets mad, or somebody lets him fall, or hits his head against a door or a chair. Here Ruth paused for breath. Then she exclaimed, "Why, of course, you must see the baby. Why, he is named for you." This was said to the judge with greatest excitement, and just as Ruth was saying it, everybody turned toward the door. And there stood little Susie, hugging the baby to her breast, his night dress dragging on the floor, her short arms barely reaching around his plump body, both baby and Susie having their faces wreathed in smiles. Staggering under the burden, this youngest sister pressed through the company with her precious armful, and as the judge saw her approach, he stepped forward, bent down above her, and took the little fellow into his arms, where he settled with a most contented and happy expression. It was a very pretty sight, this stately old gentleman holding a beautiful baby on one arm and reaching over to the lovely, dignified wife by his side with the other arm. For she had taken hold of his hand again after he had fixed the baby comfortably on his arm. And Ruth had stationed herself close by the judge's wife on the other side and taken possession of the lady's free hand. "And this is the baby, is it?" inquired Mrs. Judge. "What a dear little boy he is. And what did you say you called him?" For the lady was either deaf or absorbed so that she did not hear all that Ruth had said about the baby's name. "Why, we call him after your husband. Didn't you hear me say so? He is the little judge. Just see how he clings to his namesake. Is he the judge's namesake or the judge his namesake? I don't know which is which, only it's something about namesake, and he's named for the judge." This latter talk on the part of Ruth was quite as much to herself as to the visitors. And all the time the judge was gazing down into the infant's face with earnest, wistful look, seeming almost to forget that he was once more standing in the old east parlor. Yes, for a moment he had really forgotten where he did stand, for he was thinking of the many years ago when 2 other baby boys had been placed in his arms, and with what hope and tenderness he had handled the small, helpless pieces of humanity. "Don't you like the name?" interrupted Ruth. "We thought it would please you." "What makes you look so solemn?" "Oh, I know." Now Ruth did not intend to be cruel. She was simply thoughtless, like many other children. "You had a baby boy once, didn't you? 2 of them, didn't you?" And then she saw that Mrs. Judge seemed to feel bad too, and that she let go of the judge's hand for a moment and dashed away some tears from her eyes. "I'm sorry if I've hurt your feelings," said Ruth. "I didn't mean to. I was just thinking about your 2 baby boys. They would have been awful old if they had lived till now, wouldn't they? And we never should have lived in this house if they had lived, would we?" A hush had fallen on the company. Neither the judge nor his wife made any reply. They were lost in thought, while the children watched them with breathless interest. "We didn't dare give him your full name," continued Ruth. "That's what Dr. Blank did to one of his baby boys, and it died. Mother was afraid if we called our baby after you with the 3 long names that it might kill him, so she said, so we dropped the middle one, and I think it much better, don't you?" "Dear little boy," said the judge affectionately as he looked down into his face again. "Dear little boy." And then the judge bent down and kissed him, and the baby beamed with delight. It was almost like a baptism in church. "I thought maybe you were going to pray over him. That's the way Father does, you know." But the judge didn't seem to hear. "My dear," he said, turning to his wife and holding the baby toward her. She knew what he meant, for she likewise bent down over the little fellow and printed another kiss upon his sweet, upturned, dimpled face, and then another and a third, while the judge stood looking on with happy indulgence, and all the children noted every motion in this singular drama. "What did your boys die of?" asked Ruth, who did not wish to lose any time since she had so many questions to ask, and she feared that her visitors might not stay as long as she wished them. "Ruth!" exclaimed Samuel, who had drawn near the young inquisitor and felt it was time to stop her. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" He said this in a low tone, thinking that the judge and his wife might not hear. They were watching the baby with such eagerness that they had almost forgotten the rest of the company. "I think," remarked Mrs. Judge as she lifted her head from the baby and glanced around the room, "that it is very pleasant in the old house." "Oh, yes, we think so too." It was Ruth again speaking. The other members of the family had little chance to say anything. "Can't get a word in edgewise," whispered Henry to Helen. "What a perfect nuisance Ruth is." "Wouldn't you like to go over the house?" Of course it was Ruth who asked the question. She was always taking people over the house. It might be Monday morning when everything was in dire confusion, all the younger children still in bed, or it might be early evening after the baby and Susie had been playing in crib and bed, and things were assuming their wonted appearance of disorder. If the notion took her, she was always ready to seize a caller by the hand and lead him from cellar to garret. "I think I would like to look around a little," replied the lady. "I'm wondering how many closets you have now in the house." "Oh, there's an awful lot," exclaimed Ruth. "We have 60, observed Elizabeth, who liked to be precise. That's right, continued Mrs. Judge. "I had that number put in. I was afraid you might have given away some of them." When she said this, the children looked rather queer. Who ever heard of giving away closets? One might think there were flowers or eggs or peaches. "You used to give away a great deal, didn't you?" exclaimed Ruth. "But I don't see how you could give away closets." And now the whole company started on a tour of sightseeing the old house. Samuel and Elizabeth naturally took the lead, being the oldest, and quite the lady and gentleman. The judge with the baby on one arm and his wife leaning on the other followed. Ruth still clung to the right hand of Mrs. Judge. Then the remaining children came in a dense crowd just behind them. "The parlor looks much as it did when we left it, except the furniture," said the lady. "Now let us see if they have kept the other rooms as well." They passed next into the hall. "Dear me, what is this?" exclaimed the judge. "Where are we?" For it was not the old hall at all. They had been rather short and small. This was long, reaching through the house. "Why, what has become of my bedroom?" inquired the lady. "They have made it into this hall. And where are all the nice little closets under the stairs? You certainly haven't given them away. Oh dear, I'm so sorry." "I guess you're tired," said Ruth. "It makes you nervous to walk much, doesn't it?" "Why, yes, I know, because they say you never went upstairs for ever so many years." "Oh, I know what we'll do. You can ride." All this time Mrs. Judge was looking about her in a dazed way, quite at sea in respect to her surroundings, for the hall had been completely changed, until it appeared about as different could be, and the good lady was really shocked. "Do you see those things under the stairs? They are our bicycles." And the judge and his wife gazed with perplexed faces in the direction indicated. There was a whole row of them, 7 altogether, full-grown, half-grown, or any size you might wish. It was like a carriage shop. "I think you might ride one all through the house downstairs," said Ruth to the lady guest. "Then you wouldn't have to walk." And as the suggestion was made, Ruth's eyes flashed and her cheeks grew flushed with excitement. What fun it would be to push the good woman on a bicycle from room to room and show her the present arrangements of the beloved house. But Mrs. Judge was horrified. She clung very closely to her husband, as if she thought that she might have to perch upon one of those machines, whether she wished it or not. Her breath came fast and short. Her cheeks grew hectic. "You don't mean to say that people ride those things?" she finally exclaimed, when her first flurry of agitation was past. "Yes," replied Ruth delightedly. "We all ride 'em." "Not your father and mother? The minister and the minister's wife?" "Why, yes, and the Episcopal minister, too, and his wife." "Are you sure, Judge, that you didn't bring a fan with you?" The good woman seemed very faint, and she looked beseechingly toward her husband. "Here's one," shouted Susie, who ran to the cabinet and found a lovely piece of feather work, which scattered very fine feathers over your clothes and through the room on every motion you made with it. And as the judge's wife waved it back and forth, the feathers began to fly. "It looks like a snowstorm," whispered Herbert to Theodora, and soon the feather flakes adorned their garments and floated through the air so that one was really reminded of a fresh fall of snow. It took the good lady a long time to get her breath. The hall closets were all gone, and in their places stood 7 things called bicycles, upon which the minister, his wife, and the children were said to ride. It was awful, and Ruth was urging her to try one. Alas, the hall was too much for her self-possession. "Let us go into the west room," she said faintly. So they all came into what is now the family sitting room and library. Here everything was strange. The door into the kitchen was covered with a high bookcase filled with literature. The small cubbyhole through which dishes and food had been passed from dining room to kitchen was now made into a door. But there was one familiar object before them. In the far corner stood the clock, grave and stalwart, sentinel for the house. "My dear, do you see the clock?" It was the judge speaking to his wife. He knew there must be many changes in the house. He accepted them very quietly, but he was glad to see this old familiar friend. He had expected to find it in the hall where it had always stood during his day, but he was just as glad to see it here in the old dining room. That clock had been present on all the great occasions of life. It had marked the hours for every event connected with the history of the house. When the long line of famous men and women entertained by the judge and his wife came to mind, it was to be recollected that the clock had seen them all, and winked and blinked at them morning, noon, and night, and sounded his warning notes in their ears when it was time to rise or retire or to eat or to go to court or to drive to town or to start for church. It was like meeting a tried and beloved friend. Both the judge and his wife were overjoyed. It might have been that some indifferent family had lived in the house and thrown the clock out of doors or stored it in the attic. There are people so dull and unimaginative, people with so little sentiment, that they never care for keepsakes or heirlooms. They want everything fresh and new about them. Antiques are a perfect bore or nuisance. Happily, the minister's family was not one of this kind. They all had a great deal of what is called historic sense. They liked old things, and the clock was their most sacred possession. How much they had talked about it and dreamed about the scenes which had passed before it. While Ruth had invented more wild stories in connection with that one object than could be told in many a day. The other things in the room attracted little attention. The visitors made their slow and stately way across to the corner where the clock stood. As they looked up into its serene face, the object of their interest looked down upon them with a very knowing expression, seeming to recognize them on the instant, extending them a very hearty welcome. For the tick-tick was louder than ever before. The very frame of the huge thing began to tremble with suppressed excitement, and then 8 long, loud strokes sounded through the entire house, as much as to say, "They've come. How'd you do? Glad to see you," and other kind greetings. The children had all followed the judge and his wife, and they were eagerly watching for the next movement on the part of the visitors. So here they are with the clock, and there's Mrs. Judge and Ruth and all the kids. It made quite a striking picture, the tall, solemn clock in the far corner of the room, the judge and the baby on his arm, and the wife holding Ruth by the hand, standing in front of it. Then the throng of alert and wondering children bringing up in the rear, for they all felt that something out of the ordinary was about to happen. In fact, the whole visit of these former inhabitants of the house was rather unusual, so that the children would naturally expect fresh marvels at any moment. It was clear that Mrs. Judge was getting tired. Nobody had offered her a chair, and she had refused to get on a bicycle. Suddenly, the door of the clock swung open. "I think you had better rest, my dear," said the judge. "We'll step in here." And as he made the remark, he put his foot into the clock and gave a lively spring, filling the small doorway. "Oh, please don't take the baby away," screamed Ruth as she saw them both disappearing. "Who'll nurse him? And Mama will feel so bad." But it was all done so quickly that Ruth never finished her speech, for the judge still held his wife's hand and helped her into the clock. Then as Ruth held all the faster to the lady's hand, she was caught up too. All went into the clock, and the door shut upon them. The other children were struck dumb with amazement. "I always thought that it looked like a coffin," exclaimed Samuel, "but I never expected to see 4 people buried alive in it." "I've wanted to hide in it 100 times," said Helen, "but I never supposed—" 10,000 times are hid in it," interrupted Henry. "Times out of mind," whispered Herbert. "Time, time," cried Samuel, and soon they indeed had a time. So thank you for joining me on our second virtual story time here at the museum. Again, my name is Karen Burke. Where the museum is happy to be connected with you, please post or send any comments or questions you might have about the Sherman Parsonage or anything about the library. I'm happy to answer them. I hope you enjoyed the story, and hope you can make it back to the museum and to the library when things are back to normal here. Invite your friends and family. We hope you can join us again. Thank you, and be well. Bye.